Taiwan, baby.
Taiwan.
To this day.
To this day. To this day.
To this day.
We're covering today's top boxing news.
Lyndon Arthur versus Anthony Yarde. Let's talk about the fight. You know, Lyndon Arthur's minimalist approach to a boxing match in this situation against this style of fighter, this kind of opponent, really was a stroke of genius, because against a heavy-handed puncher like Anthony Yarde, an artillery guy, against a guy like that, less is more. The less punches you put together against a guy like Anthony Yarde, the less you throw, the more you deprive him of the opportunity to use his finer qualities.
Pretty much.
His attributes, namely his power. Lyndon Arthur quite intuitively fought this fight behind his lead hand, his left hand, fought this fight with his jab, and he won this fight with his jab.
And very little else.
Before you go making comparisons to how Joe Joyce won the Dubois fight with his jab, this fight did not have the aesthetic of that fight because Anthony Yarde was not having any of the success that Daniel Dubois was having before he decided that he'd had enough. Anthony Yarde didn't get to use very much of his power. I mean, he didn't get to land the heavy kind of shots that we saw in Dubois versus Joyce. In this fight, it was quite the opposite, as Lyndon Arthur effectively neutralized the vast majority of Anthony Yarde's offense by simply employing his jab and keeping Anthony outside of the pocket.
Outside of his sweet spot.
Anthony Yarde, in spite of being a heavy-handed puncher, in spite of being an artillery kind of guy, what he isn't is a pressure fighter. Don't ever be fooled. A pressure fighter's pressure is consistent. It's consistent in their barrage of punches, the volume of shots they throw, or their ability to keep up with their opponent via their footwork. Whereas Anthony Yarde's inability to cut the ring off was there in plain sight for everyone to see. He was following Lyndon Arthur on the receiving end of Lyndon Arthur's jabs, whereas if he were cutting the ring off
effectively,
Lyndon Arthur wouldn't have had as many escape routes as he did, circling away from Anthony whilst simultaneously pumping out that jab to maintain distance, to keep Anthony at arm's length, where his offense is neutralized. Anthony Yarde himself, he seems to think that he did enough to win the fight. He seems to think that he was forcing the issue, but you're not forcing anything when you're not landing. And for the vast majority of this fight, Anthony Yarde wasn't landing much of anything. He tried with the jab, tried to get off some lead right hands, and at least 2 times he got off some real hard shots, got off some real heavy leather. But that's about it.
Punches.
Credit to Lyndon Arthur for not hitting the deck. I don't know what the hell was keeping that guy up. Perhaps you could make the argument that Anthony Yarde was picking up rounds by way of forcing the issue, being the aggressor, the guy coming forward, and forcing the other guy back. Perhaps you could make that argument if Lyndon Arthur wasn't landing, but that's just it. He was landing. He was landing his jab. The argument that one fighter is forcing the issue more than the other, and in that way he's picking up the rounds, only comes into it if neither guy is landing.
Neither one.
But it was very obvious in the early goings of this fight that Lyndon Arthur was touching Anthony Yarde with the jab. He was touching Anthony Yarde with the jab, and he was controlling Anthony Yarde with the jab. Anthony, who tried his best to close the gap on Lyndon Arthur, get close enough to this guy to start landing hard shots and putting punches together, but a good amount of the time that's not what he was doing. He was just giving Lyndon Arthur different looks to try to gain ground on that guy, and that just didn't happen often enough.
Those were some quiet rounds.
But I'll tell you that those were still rounds that I gave to Lyndon Arthur because you knew what Anthony Yarde was trying to do, and you knew that if he's not able to do it, it's because Lyndon Arthur is preventing him from doing it, essentially preventing Anthony Yarde from fighting his fight. Truth, I find it very hard to watch this fight again and find more than, 2-3 rounds that I could give to Anthony Yarde, most of which came very late. I think the 12th and final round was Anthony Yarde's best round, but by that time you're a day late and $1 short. And I won't slight Anthony Yarde for his limitations. I won't slight him for his deficiencies, because in that way I'd be shortchanging Lyndon Arthur on his performance. Put simply, Lyndon Arthur fought the right fight against a guy with more world-level experience than himself. I think it's safe to say that.
Fuck over.
With respect to both fighters, styles make fights, and Lyndon Arthur exhibited the right style to effectively defuse Anthony Yarde. That if Anthony Yarde is a ticking time bomb waiting to go off, then Lyndon Arthur defused that bomb. Moving forward, I don't think Anthony Yarde needs any more glaring examples that something in his corner needs to change. That Tunde Ayahi, for all his best intentions and his best efforts, he can't give Anthony Yarde what he needs to make him a complete fighter, to make him and turn him into a world-level contender. Something has to change. And I know this is going to sound funny to a lot of you guys out there, but I happen to think that Anthony Yarde and Abel Sanchez would be a good fit, would be a good pairing, given the kind of attributes that Anthony Yarde already has. Now, some of that stuff that Abel Sanchez used to do with Gennady Golovkin, if he could get some of that stuff to rub off on Anthony, Anthony would be a better fighter for it. Better usage of his lead hand, better timing, learning how to cut off the ring as opposed to following a guy around and eating jabs in the process of doing so. I happen to think that Abel Sanchez could do more for Anthony Yarde than Tunde Ajayi ever could. But for now, congratulations to Lyndon Arthur in his big step-up fight for advancing to a professional record of 18-0. This kid, he's a big kid for the light heavyweight division. Good dimensions, and he knows how to use his height. Gonna be keeping my eye on this guy moving forward. Congratulations to Lyndon Arthur. Errol Spence Jr. versus Danny Garcia. Let's talk about the fight. First things first, I want to say that I'm glad that Errol Spence Jr. looked the way that he looked, that he is in the condition that he's in, that he hasn't been rendered damaged goods as a result of the car accident. I'm glad he's every bit the formidable welterweight that he was before that unfortunate incident last year. That being said, let's get down to brass tacks. Let's talk about the fight. Ahead of this match, I told you guys, I warned you, that Danny Garcia is not some welterweight monster. That everything in his track record since he arrived at this weight indicates that, yeah, he's a solid guy, he's not a pushover.
You're right.
But for Errol, he's little more than a litmus test. He is little more than just a tune-up.
And that's how he fought.
The bane of Danny Garcia has always been that he doesn't do enough. He just doesn't do enough in there to win the fight, to make it unanimous, to make it decisive. In this match with Errol Spence Jr., I think that's an understatement, because he was completely out-hustled, completely outmaneuvered, completely outworked by a guy who hasn't seen any action at all in 14 months. Danny Garcia often fights reactionary fights. The kind of fights to where if Danny's not careful, he's going to end up letting the other guy set the tempo of the match. And that's very much what happened here, more so than it has in the past. Try and understand why I called Danny Garcia a tune-up for Errol Spence Jr. Errol's got a slight height advantage, a slight reach advantage, and it just so happens that Errol is a southpaw.
Right.
That has a lot to do with why Danny Garcia just couldn't get anything going in this match. Errol Spence Jr. is very good at maintaining distance with his jab, with his lead hand. And in the buildup of this fight, I figured that, Danny Garcia, he's not going to be able to find his way around Errol Spence Jr.'s jab. And if he can't do that, then he won't be able to get close enough to him to start hooking off. Danny Garcia is at his best mid-range to inside, but in order to get there,
To hook off.
you've got to win the jabbing contest. And Danny Garcia, he just ain't much of a jabber. Well, even if he were, Danny being an orthodox fighter, Errol Spence Jr. being a southpaw, that creates a very tricky situation.
The battle for lead foot advantage.
And in this battle, Errol Spence Jr. quite clearly initiated all the action. Look, Danny Garcia, he's not much of a jabber, doesn't have the fastest hands, doesn't have the fastest feet, isn't particularly athletic, he's not a particularly prolific puncher. Danny's not a volume guy.
Never was.
If he's anything, he's a counterpuncher, the kind of guy who's looking for the opportunity to land something hard. But whilst he's waiting for that opportunity, that window, to get off a hard shot, get the other guy hurt and start pouring it on, while he's waiting for that to happen, he is sacrificing rounds. This is why Danny Garcia has often been accused of not doing enough. Errol Spence Jr., you've got a guy who's essentially initiating all the action, and because he's got faster hands than you, he's beating you to the punch.
That's one.
At the same time, he's coming forward, stepping into his shots, pressuring you, and forcing you back.
That's two.
Forcing you to get on the defensive and give up some real estate, give yourself some room, so you're not on the receiving end of those shots. But whilst this is going on, you can't set up your shots, you can't set up your punches. Whether it was a jab up top or a stab downstairs, the trajectory of the punch, the angle which it's coming from, Errol Spence Jr. being a southpaw,
Right.
Danny being an orthodox fighter, it creates a situation to where Danny don't even get to throw his setup punch because Errol Spence Jr.'s setup punch is just on the outside of Danny's. Extra credit has to go to Errol Spence Jr. for being able to apply this kind of pressure on Danny Garcia, who is a counterpuncher.
He is.
Extra credit has to be given to Errol Spence Jr. because he was able to be the busier fighter whilst at the same time staying defensively astute. It takes a lot of ring savvy. It really does take a lot of ring IQ to effectively outwork the other guy whilst simultaneously staying defensible, depriving that guy of opportunities to get into the fight. It was really a sight, and I'm glad that Errol Spence Jr. was able to put forward this kind of a performance, that he really went for it, you know? I'm glad because that shows that he is all there, that he is the Errol Spence Jr. of old, that he hasn't been rendered damaged goods as a result of the car accident. I'm glad that Errol Spence Jr. is in tip-top shape, but make no mistake, you saw the fight. This is why I told you guys in the build-up of it that Danny Garcia is little more than just a litmus test. Danny Garcia is a tune-up for Errol Spence Jr., and that's how he went out there and fought, like a tune-up kind of guy. I wasn't against Errol Spence Jr. having a tune-up fight 14 months out, coming off that car accident. I was okay with that. What I wasn't okay with is charging people $80 to see Errol Spence Jr. in a tune-up fight. If you ask me, Danny didn't put forth a performance that belongs on pay-per-view. I don't think anybody should have to pay $80 to see Danny Garcia trying to survive against Errol Spence Jr. You know, I saw what some folks out there were saying ahead of this match in reference to Danny Garcia. So many folks were blowing so much smoke up so many asses, I almost thought we weren't talking about the same guy. Are there two Danny Garcias in the welterweight division? Is there one that I don't know about? Because the one that I'm familiar with, you know, this is a guy who's known, has a reputation for not doing enough. A guy with slow feet, not the fastest hands, isn't the most prolific puncher. He's got a solid chin.
It's okay.
Takes a decent punch.
It's okay.
But you're under no threat at all being outworked by Danny Garcia. And that's what makes Danny Garcia a tune-up kind of guy, a tune-up kind of opponent for Errol Spence Jr., who had been out of action roughly 14 months. That, yeah, you know, Danny's solid. He's going to pose some resistance, but overall, you're under no threat of being outworked by this guy because Danny Garcia just isn't a physical, rough-and-tumble kind of fighter. Doesn't have the highest work rate. He's not the most prolific puncher. He doesn't have the fastest hands or the fastest feet. His claim to fame is being able to take a hard shot. That just means he's there to be hit. So when I told you, and when I tell you, that Danny Garcia is a tune-up for Errol Spence Jr.
Why are you mad?
I don't understand. Am I missing something? Did he look like more than just a tune-up out there? Did he put forth some kind of elite-level performance that I missed out on? Because I saw a tune-up. That's what I saw. I saw a tune-up fight against a tune-up kind of guy. That's what I've been telling you all along.
And that's what I told you this was going to be.
Remember a couple of days ago when we talked about Tim Bradley's comments? About how Danny Garcia and his style is tailor-made for Errol Spence Jr. He's a made-to-order opponent for Errol Spence. And Danny Garcia's only out in this fight is if Errol Spence Jr. has been rendered damaged goods as a result of the car accident. But if he hasn't, then Errol, well, he should be able to go in there and beat Danny comfortably. And that's more or less what he did. I liked the straight punches from Errol Spence Jr. from the outside coming in, and I liked his body work deep in the pocket. Vintage Errol Spence Jr. As he laid into Danny Garcia, whose only opportunity to really get off shots was when Errol Spence Jr. decided to close the gap on him. As Errol stepped into his jab to get within range of Danny and let some shots go on the inside. In these moments, you saw Danny Garcia trying to counter, trying to hook off.
Yeah.
Every so often, something got through. Every so often, he would touch Errol with a shot. And I think that it was important to see how Errol reacts in those moments, to see whether or not Errol was rendered damaged goods as a result of the car accident. The only way that question could be answered is to see how Errol reacts once he's hit. Errol Spence Jr., for the most part, he did weather the shots.
He looked okay.
Looked all right. I liked the jab of Errol Spence Jr., the body work of Errol Spence Jr., the footwork of Errol Spence Jr., who touched Danny Garcia with the jab, thereby initiating the action. And if Danny Garcia should let off a counter shot, Errol Spence Jr. quite intuitively would take that half step back to maintain distance while simultaneously fencing with Danny Garcia, showing that lead hand, that right hand, which Danny Garcia struggled greatly to find his way around.
Everything Errol did was off the jab.
Whether Errol was coming forward, initiating the action, getting on his front foot, or moving backwards, fighting off his back foot. Whether Errol was playing the offensive or playing the defensive, he never abandoned his jab.
Textbook stuff.
I think a lot of you guys out there weren't really listening to what I was trying to tell you, that if Danny Garcia's only out in this fight is Errol being damaged goods, what happens if he's not? If that's your only chance of winning this fight, doesn't that then mean that you're relying on Errol being a broken fighter in order to win? Is that your only out? Is that your only chance?
Yikes.
I mean, what's the plan? What's the strategy?
Danny went out there and did the same shit he always does.
Fighting a reactionary kind of fight to where it's the other guy setting the tempo. It's the other guy dictating the action, dictating the aesthetic of the fight, what the fight looks like. It's the other guy that's in control because Danny Garcia is in essence acquiescing control. He's just reacting to what the other guy's doing. He's not taking the initiative and taking the fight to the other fighter, taking the fight from the other fighter. You know, I didn't expect that to all of a sudden change with Errol Spence Jr.
Danny Garcia's always been that way.
And now you know why I called him a tune-up. Credit to Errol Spence Jr. for getting back into action and getting back into action in style. That's how you defend your titles. That's how I wanted him to look. I wanted him to be all there, firing on all cylinders. Congratulations to Errol Spence Jr. in his big comeback fight.